Somehow, it's still cold out here. So what could be better than gathering around the fire, roasting up some hot cocoa or some hot vanilla coffee, vanilla gang where you at, and listening to some spooky stories about terrifying things that were found in the snow. Prepare your coziest blanket and your sanity to enjoy these stories. If you have a scary experience of your own and you want it narrated, share it with us at darkstories.org, and like and share this video to help us keep the channel alive. Also, let me know in the comments what your favorite kind of coffee is. I'm partial to a hot vanilla Italian sweet cream myself. Oh, and I'm currently working on getting a new app to you guys. You'll be able to submit stories, read stories, listen to my royalty-free music, watch my videos, and listen to all my podcasts, all in one cozy little spot. So, stay tuned. Now let's begin. Morning Snow Stalker, from Some Random Cat. I live in a small town in the mountains that's mostly populated with other people who enjoy sports in the snow. Other than that, there's nothing that really goes on here. I used to attend high school high up in the mountains. No idea why they decided to build it so high up out there. But there were rumors it used to be some sort of laboratory, or something along those lines. But of course, I don't really have proof of that. As far as I know, no one does. My school being so high up meant walking there was a pain. You had to walk up a steep, empty street, surrounded with thick forests. This was about an hour walk for me. As often as I could, I would get my mom to drive me to school in the mornings. Only one day there was a huge snowfall, and my mom's little car couldn't make it up all the way. This meant I would have to walk up that mountain, in the snow, in the dark. As it was still around 6 when I started walking, I had to have a head start because the walk was already long. It would only take longer in the snow. So I started my hike up to the school, listening to that satisfying crunch of fresh snow under my feet. As I got deeper into the mountain, I began to feel more uncomfortable with my surroundings. Probably because I noticed I was completely alone, other than a lone car driving by every 10 minutes or so. As I continued to listen to my footsteps, I noticed they were echoing, which was odd because they never did that before. I figured the crunching snow was causing enough sound to actually cause an echo. I continued to walk until I realized that the sound of that echo wasn't an echo at all. Rather, it was another pair of footsteps trying its best to hide behind my own. I stopped. I looked behind myself to see nothing there. I shrugged, hoping that it was just paranoia. When I began walking again, the echo was gone, only to begin again around a minute later. This really unsettled me. I again stopped to look behind me over my shoulder, but once more, there was nothing there. This pattern repeated about 5 more times. My confidence was almost entirely gone, and panic had replaced it. I had quickened my pace as much as I could. Any faster and I'd probably just fall face first into the snow. Eventually, when I did look behind me again, I finally caught a glimpse of my stalker. They were way too tall. I only caught a glimpse of them before they hid behind a tree within the tree line. Seeing something that bizarre and extraordinary, and realizing it's been following you for a while, it causes a deep kind of fear. I stood there frozen, staring at that tree for at least 10 minutes, waiting for that thing to come out, but completely unsure I even wanted to see it again. I then convinced myself that I had to run, even if I fell again and again. I turned around and bolted. I sprinted the remaining half hour, not daring to look back. That echo continued from the tree line all the way until I got to the lit portion in front of my school. And when I made it to school, it had been canceled due to the snow. Thankfully, this time I was able to get a ride down to my house with a friend. After this incident, I refused to walk up the mountain alone ever again. A Horrifying Sight from Jory B. This happened when I was 13 years old. I was with my older brother and my father, playing with my dog in an empty parking lot at around 11 p.m. It was at an old church in Alberta, and it was snowing pretty hard outside. We walked our dog around here quite often, and used the empty lot to just sort of hang out in, and let the dog get some exercise. At that moment, we were running from the dog, trying to get him to chase us, so we could get out all of his energy before we headed back home. It was a dumb little game, but I was pretty slow. To be forward, I'm short. When I ran to the other side of the church to around the front entrance, waiting for my dog to continue running up to me, he never did. I was confused, so I looked around the corner of the building to see where my dog was. But he was just standing there, frozen in place. When he began to angrily growl and bark, he scared me a little bit. I had no idea why he was so mad or scared. That lasted for a few seconds, until his sounds turned into whimpers. Then he ran off to find my dad. I was definitely freaked out back there. I was about to start walking back to Dad too, when I heard something like a growl coming from behind me. I was horrified, and I turned around to see what it was, only to be petrified to the spot. There was a humanoid figure standing there, but its features told me that it was no man. The dark figure was about 7 feet tall. It had a large snout and legs that were inverted. Its back was heavily arched, with vertebrae popping up under the skin in a grotesque manner. And even weirder yet, it appeared to be wearing some sort of thin, weird cloth-looking material over its body. It didn't look like human clothes per se, but more like skinned hide. My dad must have seen me frozen there, so he called my name and started walking towards me. The creature noticed his shadow approaching and began to scurry away toward the alley. My dad saw how distressed I was. He asked me what was wrong. I didn't hold back. I explained everything to him, but he laughed at me, telling me to grow up and that it was probably a deer. I said fine, whatever. But as he was walking back to my brother, I glanced back to the alleyway and I saw it staring at me. I called for my dad to prove to him that it was still there. But by the time I got his attention, the creature was gone once more. Back in the lot, we started to play some catch with a baseball until we all heard this loud bang, like a hammer hitting metal doors. It came from the back of the church. My brother was curious, so he walked around the church to see what it was, but I was too scared to go back there. And now I was scared for my brother. Luckily, he came back, having seen nothing around the area. But my eyes were darting around. I was paranoid. When I heard the snap of a twig, I glanced over to a small bundle of trees near the tiny metal fence, and there it was again, just watching me. For what purpose, I have no idea. I screamed for my brother and my dad. They ran over quickly enough this time to finally see the creature walking away. They believed me, so we went home immediately. To this day, I have not seen it again, but this moment will never escape my memory. Encounter with a Phantasm from KimsAPseudonym. I'm a private investigator living in the South. When people learn that about myself, it's usually met with a certain amount of interest, given that TV has cast private investigators in a very intriguing light. In reality, our lives are usually mundane. More unremarkable vehicles and peeing in bottles than Ferraris and beaches. I haven't seen too many noteworthy or exciting things in my line of work. I've been rushed by a few dogs, harassed by mentally unstable people, and busted plenty of times by an intended subject. But all in all, it's steady, boring work. But I do have one story that, for fear of sounding sensational, changed my life. It was January, a month that falls into what myself and my partners know as the dregs of the slow season. When I got the call to work a fairly easy assignment, about an hour and a half away from my home, I was pleased to have it. The assignment was just that, scraps. It was for a gypped and angry car lot owner who had spent way too much time and patience attempting to locate a woman who he believed had skipped town in a less than paid off SUV. She's gotta be in that area. That's where the GPS last hit before it died, I was told. It wasn't scandalous high-profile work, but I was happy to have it. Snow began to fall as I loaded up my equipment bag into the car, stocked with spare camera batteries, snacks, and the like. I kissed my husband goodbye, zipped up my jacket, then plugged in a random address that fell within the last known latitude-longitude coordinates the client had provided from the last ping on the car's GPS. After nearly 2 hours of sipping coffee and half-heartedly dialing my radio back and forth, the channels crackled weakly as I drove further and further away from modern civilization and into sprawling pastures of the rural backcountry. Finally, I found myself within the target area. Houses slowly became fewer and further apart as I approached a long stretch of road. The roadway looked gloomy in the haze of the afternoon winter. Its length dipped and craned painfully on for what seemed like miles through farmland. I knew as I proceeded down it, slowly, that it would be a difficult area to set up in. I observed the sides of the road, devoid of any shoulders and yielding abruptly from pavement to mucky, snow-soaked ditches. I quickly dismissed the idea of just pulling off into the grass. I checked my phone and saw that I had no signal, too. This would be a terrible area to get stuck in with no reception, given that I'd seen no houses for miles and the snow only fell heavier by the hour. Turning around carefully, I drove back towards where I'd come from until a single faint bar appeared in the corner of my cell phone screen. Using the weak signal, I consulted my map and deduced that the long, desolate road I'd come from connected two main highways, and I guessed that the SUV I was looking for was sure to be using it as a throughway. Satisfied, but not convinced, I said goodbye to the idea of mindlessly browsing Facebook all evening and headed back to the area. The sleet sloshed beneath my tires as I slowed down outside of a small ranch-style home. It was a little ways off the road at the end of a gravel drive. The house was somber, but looked charming with fresh snow settling on its worn roof. I approached the house, the boards of the porch stoop moaning under my boots. I knocked carefully and smiled immediately so as to appear non-threatening to whomever answered the door. The latch on the other side of the door fell, and shortly after, the door opened. To my surprise, instead of being hit with the contrasting warm air of a home, I was enveloped by a musty, cool draft that seemed to belch up from deep inside the house. Inside the doorway stood a man I gauged to be in his 80s. His eyes were brown and sad, his face weathered, his wrinkles set deep into his face as if he'd been carved out of the red clay soil that rested just inches below the snow outside. Even though he did not stand taller than myself, he still seemed to look down on me, his broad frame occupying most of the doorway. I smiled wider now, as if to prompt his own sober countenance to do so, but it didn't. Awkwardly, I spoke. "I hate to bother you, but I've come all this way to look for a car I believe is in the area. I was wondering if you'd be okay with me sitting at the end of your driveway for a little while, to keep a lookout." I had almost made an art out of playing up my innocent woman status for my own advantage, and I'd be lying if I said that wasn't what I was doing in the moment. He didn't answer right away. He looked at me, studying me, his face never warming, and only serving to wear me down with silence. For a moment, I felt my damsel facade had finally fallen on unwilling ears. I prepared myself for swift denial, but he just stood there. That's when I took note of his clothing. A plaid shirt tucked into tan slacks ended in slick, black dress shoes. Hardly what I'd expect a gentleman of his age to be wearing in this weather, especially since his home didn't seem to be much warmer than the air outside. He clenched a blue wooden pipe between his teeth, chewing the tip thoughtfully. He looked terribly faint, almost jaundiced, as if my palm might pass right through him if I offered him my hand to shake. Just at that moment, he seemed satisfied with how long he'd studied me, and perhaps deciding I wasn't a threat or trouble, he looked past me to my car, back down to me, then nodded his head in approval. I thanked him, and I was eager to retreat back to my warm car. Crunching snow and gravel beneath my tires, I caught one last look of his door shutting before I found an unimposing spot near the end of the driveway and began my surveillance. As a woman in this line of work, I've come to be aware of my own environment. It's not my nature and only came out of habit. I often look into my rear and side view mirrors to check my surroundings. Doing so, I took note of the man's house. It was dark. Even as the sun began to set and darkness creeped into the valley, I never noticed any interior lights in the home. I suspected he may be entirely frugal, keeping as few lights on as possible. That also explained why his home would be so cold. I smirked, remembering how my own father would keep a watchful eye on the thermostat, so as to prevent us kids who refused to put sweaters on from tinkering with the dial. Having seen only 2 sedans in the hours since I had arrived, I finally phoned it in and began my trek home. The next week passed by, and I once again loaded up my car for another assignment, about an hour north of the man's home. I couldn't shake how sad he looked, and wondered whether or not he had anyone to care for him. His absent demeanor and sad, faraway eyes still occupied my mind every now and then. I scratched out a thank you note, bought a box of cookies, and decided I'd leave a little earlier so I could stop by and deliver them to him. I felt compelled to show my appreciation for him letting me, a complete stranger, take refuge on his property to do some scummy repo spotting work. By this time, the snow had melted, and the roads were far more formidable, albeit cold and damp. I made the familiar turn off the lonely stretch of road and slowly crunched down the driveway. To my surprise, I found a new car parked near the home, as well as 2 utility trucks. A woman stood outside speaking with a man who donned a tool belt and boots, making it easy to surmise his occupation. The woman motioned toward the house, speaking with her hands, and a worker appeared to consider whatever it was she was saying. She looked on at me, trying to place who I was as I stepped out. Calling out a greeting, I approached, the letter and cookies tucked under my arm. I explained who I was and how I was just wanting to say thank you to the man that lived here for his generosity, explaining that I would not have been able to do my job if not for him. I felt a twinge of embarrassment when I realized that I'd never gotten the man's name. This woman studied me with the same eyes as the old man had, only hers were livelier and more skeptical. She told me in an almost accusatory tone that nobody should have been there, and that she had only just come up from the north to begin renovating the home to sell. She looked to the contractors with slight annoyance, to which they both denied being responsible, without actually being asked any questions. She looked back to me and explained that her father built the home in 1942 and lived there up until his death 4 years ago, leaving the house unoccupied ever since. She felt completely violated that someone had been squatting in her childhood home. I apologized out of sympathy, while stifling my own fear and bewilderment that I may have been speaking to a crazed man who was eyeing me, possibly deciding whether or not to do God knows what. She seemed reluctant to go on, so I offered up some feigned interest in the home's history in an effort to help her regain some of the autonomy she seemed to lose in light of finding out about the break-in. She walked me around the perimeter, telling me about an old sand pit she played in as a child and how she planned on making it into a garden. She continued through the tour, explaining how she planned to repurpose and restore certain things. The memories seemed to warm her from the inside out, as if I began to disappear while she reminisced. I opened up the box of cookies and offered them to her. I got one out and bit into it. I laughed as I offered her one. Here, that old crazy doesn't deserve these. She forced a half-genuine laugh and took a cookie. She then reached into her back jean pocket and pulled out an iPhone. She switched over to the gallery, opening an album of photos she had taken of old Polaroid pictures of the home in its former glory. She swiped as she explained each, and pointed out their original locations. A photo of her as a child sitting in her sand pit with an old family dog named Baba. A large knockout rosebush that had stood near the entrance years ago, which had been her mother's pride and joy, and she'd spend hours each week pampering it. She swiped through more photos. An old pickup truck, her mother holding her infant brother on the stoop that had previously moaned under my boots, a chicken coop surrounded by heritage chickens, and finally, a photo of her father. A broad, weathered man clutching a pipe in his teeth, grinning at the camera, wearing a plaid shirt tucked into tan pants, ending in slick black dress shoes. The Shadow Man Below, from Wicca Boo. As a little girl, I grew up in the backwoods of eastern Pennsylvania. All of my memories of the sticks are terrifying, but this is my most horrifyingly memorable experience. Around the ages of 13 or 14, my best friend's house was always where I stayed. I spent years practically living in her little trailer for the entire summer. I remember winter that year was rough, and we got around 6 inches of snow during winter break. Of course, I was determined to spend the time off of school at my friend's place, so it wasn't surprising when I ended up stuck for a few days due to the amount of ice and snow covering the roads. The cold weather made for a day of cozy hot chocolate, movies, crafting, and the most important part, a wood-burning furnace. Me and my friend had just finished making some crafts. Night had begun to fall onto the sky. The trailer had around 7 rooms, a bathroom, 4 bedrooms, a kitchen, and an extension they built into the back, which served as the living room. The room faced the woods that stretched for miles of untouched land, which I knew because we frequently found ourselves exploring it. The extension had a couch, furnace, TV, stand, a chair, 2 glass sliding doors that pulled out onto a small deck, where her dad kept the logs, and her cats sat delicately as they ate. Beyond the porch and out of view of the glass doors by just a tad was her father's workshop, where he often spent his days and nights, only coming inside to add another log on the flame. My friend and I spent a lot of time in the room because her bedroom was small and the couch in the extension could fold into a full-sized bed. We kept blankets inside the couch, so when it rolled out, we could immediately fall asleep. And with it being a freezing winter night, we passed out under many covers across from the burning wood stove. I found myself hazily awakened by the cold of the door opening as her father walked into the room, illuminated by the light of the TV, which my friend finds necessary to fall asleep to. Not until he began walking across the floor did I realize that I was beginning to float. I could see my own body lying on my side, next to my friend. I knew that it was impossible to be awake because I could see myself sleeping. I stopped at the ceiling above the TV. I could smell the wood-burning smell and see the sparks as her dad laid another few logs on the fire. The small bits of snow boot prints melted on the carpet before he stopped to say goodnight to our sleeping figures, then slid the door over to go back out into the shed for a night of work. I watched our still bodies and the fire crackling for what felt like an hour before my eyes shifted to new movement. The sight of something sliding into view of the glass doors from the side of the bed caught my gaze. The figure could only be described as a black mass like a shadow. Despite the vivid colors of the TV light that danced across the glass reflecting back, the figure was void of light. Somehow it looked like the spot sucked all the rays into a total darkness, like a black hole that only existed there at one spot and one shape. It was a few minutes of complete silence as I stared at this mass before a shape began to appear. A hand sliding into my line of sight and moving the handle to the sliding door. A slow, jerky movement turned the handle, and a creak sounded across the walls as the door slid along its frame and cracked far enough open for the darkness to slide through. The familiar cold climate greeted me as my body below my eyes shivered under the covers. The creature had to duck down and bend in order to fit into the glass door frame, which was well below the height of a person. Only as it moved past the reflecting glass did the mass begin to portray the figure of a man. The shape was similar to a human, still devoid of features, entirely black, and even the color in the room seemed to have been absorbed into the void of its body. The thing walked unsteadily, as if it was unable to control its body, like a man with slinkies as feet. With each step, its length seemed to stretch and bend, like it was unable to control the way it portioned itself out. It bent back and forth, closer and further with every inch closer it stopped. I was soon able to see what appeared to be the dark shadow of a hat upon its head, which rocked back and forth. The figure abruptly stopped and vibrated as it straightened out and reached the edge of the bed, where I lay closest to the doors. He bent rigidly in the middle, but the segments of his body stayed perfectly straight. As he lowered the top part of his frame to face directly down, face to face with my closed, sleeping eyes. The dark hand jerkily pulled up, as if it was shielding its face, which was non-existent, from the TV light to look at my features better. And just like that, it stayed for another hour, perhaps. I could see myself shaking below. It was as if my subconscious knew that this mass inflicted pure terror and stillness into my body, and yet I could do nothing but watch myself cold and shaking. I had no hands to pinch myself awake from this nightmare. All I could do was watch as this thing stared, not so much breathing or moving. It was just observing me silently in the night. I was confused and horrified how any of this could be real. It was insane, unrealistic. All of a sudden, the creature straightened and hurriedly stumbled toward the door, The frame moved, opened, and closed as he slid sideways out of view of the porch door. A slam echoed outside as the workshop door opened. Familiar bootsteps walked onto the porch, stepping in the ghosts of where the creature's feet had stepped. The sound of boots marched to the door, and then inside. My friend's dad, unbothered, went over to add another log to the wood stove. He left the room after completing his task, then headed toward his room to sleep the rest of the night. I watched as the familiar scene calmed my sleeping face, the snow once again melting into boot prints on the floor, realizing that thing had never left a mark in or on the carpet. I floated there for hours as the daylight lit the room, and the darkness faded before I slid back into my body below to wake. I sat up in astonishment at how vivid my dream had been, as my friend was stirred awake. She said she had a terrible dream a few nights back, and she knew from my face that I may have seen the same thing too. My friend spoke of a man who peered out of her closet and was gone when she woke to check it out. I was baffled by this entire experience, but I've never had sleep paralysis like this before or after, and a mutual friend of ours had claimed to see the same shadow man in that very same friend's house. I know it seems crazy, but I'm convinced that house, the extension that was built onto it, it rests somewhere it's not supposed to be. The creature was more than just an energy. It was full of dread and malice, filling me with dread as well. I just know that it didn't want me there. It's been many years since I've been to that house, and I don't talk to that friend as much anymore. I can only wonder if it ever came back. Wolf Thing from MM19. I live in Minnesota, and this past winter something weird happened to me. I never had anything paranormal or weird happen to me before, so this still has me in a bit of shock. One day after a big blizzard hit, I decided to go out and take my snowmobile out. I was at least 5 miles away from my house, riding around in the fields. I began to notice a trail of blood in the snow. I didn't think too much on it. Coyotes were common around here, and they could have possibly been injured or had some prey. But then I saw where the blood was coming from. I found them, 3 dead coyotes, all torn apart. I'd never seen anything so gruesome in my life. In the distance, I heard a stick snap, and in that moment, I felt pure dread. I kept looking around to see what had made the noise, but I didn't see it at first. Not until I turned back to look straight in front of me. I saw the biggest black wolf with orangish yellow eyes at least 100 feet away from me. I was already filled with terror, facing a predator that could quickly tear me apart like it had those coyotes. But then, something bizarre happened. The creature stood on 2 legs and howled. I was astounded. It went back to all 4s, then ran towards me. I snapped back to reality. I pushed my snowmobile throttle all the way and flew out of there as fast as I could. I made it home, alive, but a little disturbed. That night I could not fall asleep, because instead of the usual coyote screams and howls, that night was filled with one singular, lone, and deep howl, one that I had heard earlier that day, and it was coming from right next to the house. Luckily, I've never seen it again, and I couldn't be more thankful for that fact. Well, that brings us to the end of this Darkness Prevails episode. But don't you worry, more scary stories are on the way soon. If you want your story narrated, share it with us at darkstories.org, and suggest below in these comments what kind of stories you want to hear next. Be sure to like and share this video to support the show, and check those links in the description. Until next time, here are the credits to my amazing patrons who have donated or continue to donate. They're great people. Remember, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.